folks. Well, you know you're in for a treat when you hear that tune because it's time for another week of the Rec Poker podcast. So thanks for joining us this week. Rec Poker is a free community of poker lovers. We study the game. We study together. We try and play against each other in the home games. We post in the forums. We join each other on the podcast. We just love poker. We're recreational players. We love sharing our love of poker with the world. And so I'd encourage everyone, if you're enjoying the show and if you have, or if you just like poker and hanging out with fun people, head on over to www.rec.poker and sign up for a free account right now. All it takes is an email address and a smile. That's right. It is a free poker learning community. So we have to thank our sponsors, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, and Running Aces and Website AMP is our other sponsor, the one and only Website Mark. Between the two of them, we get to do a lot of this stuff for free. We also do have a premium membership program. And if folks want to get involved with some of our more advanced training materials, some of our enhanced social community activities and things like that, you can use the code RECPOKER to get your first month for only $5. And it's only $15 a month after that. And I guarantee you that is the best value available in the poker market. So my name's Jim Reed. I've got the best job in the world. I get to hang out here with Wrecking Crew members every week and talk about poker strategy. If you'd like to learn more about me or the other members of the Wrecking Crew, you can go to rec.poker/crew, or you can just hear about them here, starting with John Somsky.
I'm John Somsky, and I am Poker Geek MN everywhere.
I'm Kim Kilroy. I'm Pat 33 in most places, Fergie 56 in the home game.
And I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Radman 50 just about everywhere.
And every week, we love it when our premium members come and join us in the conversation for our forums edition of the podcast. So Stu and John are here this week, and I hope that they are able to weigh in on something as we get through it. Stu and John have been great, prolific participants, not only in the forums, but also in a lot of our training conversations that we've had here at Rec Poker over the last while. So it's great to have you in the room. Thanks, fellas. So it's Monday night. We're playing in the Play Money home game on Poker Stars. We're stealing each other's chips. And just like we do every Monday night, we're taking a post from the Rec Poker forums, and we're going to talk about it here on the air. So this week, we're looking at a post by Chris Jones, the one and only, called Tricky Hand. And it's a really good name for this post because this post is about a hand where he's dealt King Jack offsuit on the button and faces an early position open raise. So we're going to talk about a few things today. In typical forums podcast tradition, we might not actually get to the meat of what Chris originally posted about, but it brought up a really interesting conversation in our group here before we started recording. So King Jack is just one of those hands. There's so many things you could say about this kind of hand. It's an implied odds nightmare hand. It's the kind of hand where you're going to get reverse implied odds. It's the kind of hand where you're typically going to lose a big pot or win a small pot. It's the kind of hand where you're going to have the second best hand a lot. Unless you flop two pair, you're not going to like a lot of flops. Either you're going to flop a king high, a pair of kings with a jack kicker, or a pair of jacks with a king kicker. And you're going to be in that middle ground of not knowing if you have a value hand or not. So this is just one of those tricky hands, and position matters a lot. Stack depth matters a lot. And the position of the other players matters a lot too in their range. And that's even before we even get post flop. So I think for the group tonight, we'll kind of just talk about pre-flop, some of the hand qualities and characteristics and some of the factors at the table that might allow us to choose to play this hand in some circumstances and not in others. So one of the things we talked about, and I know Kim Kilroy has got a couple different solver outputs up there that we can get into a little later, talking about sort of the must-dos or must-do-nots when it comes to this. Solvers are great at having those absolute rules. But I'll just start. When I'm thinking about King Jack offsuit, it's a hand where I really don't want to play a big pot with King Jack offsuit. Like I said at the top, it's going to be a hand where if you're playing a big pot, it's with someone who has a better hand than you do. So it's hard to win a big pot with King Jack. For the same reason, it's not going to be a hand I want to play out of position very often. playing out of position with hands like this, a lot of offsuit Broadway hands or one pair hands, you're going to kind of find yourself in that same jail where you've against part of your opponent's range, you've got a value hand, but against part of their range, you're drawing dead in a lot of cases, and it's just going to be hard to know where you are without making some expensive mistakes with a hand like this. So when it comes to how to play it, I don't know if the rest of the group has some ideas about sort of some rules that they have or some factors that they like to consider. I know, Rob, why don't you jump in? You got something?
Well, I hate King Jack. We were talking about this before we went live. It's just one of those hands that are just so difficult to play. When I do end up playing it, I'm very, very careful about the run out and how, it affects, my range or the strength of my hand versus his range. King Jack is a hand. It's a lot like Ace Jack. If you're sitting there facing a pre-flop raise, King Jack and Ace Jack are just kind of like they're second best to those hands that those people are coming in for a raise in early position. So what I like to do with those types of hands, if I'm, let's say I'm on the button, I have Ace Jack or King Jack, and somebody early position raises, I'll go in for a 3-bet and fold to a 4-bet.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of clarifies where you're at a little bit more. You use it as a bluff, and a lot of times you're just going to pick up that bet plus the blinds, and it's going to be sweet. And if they do end up just calling, well, now you've kind of get an idea that they're not really capped, or they are capped. They don't have necessarily those aces or those kings or those queens anymore. So now you have a little more clarity of where you are at. So I like with those types of hands, especially in position, to just a 3-bet bluff and be happy to fold to a 4-bet.
I like Rob's line of thinking. However, he did say 3-bet versus an early position raise, and I do not like that. I would just throw this hand away versus an early position raise unless I was suited, and then I would call as a suited hand on the button, especially when I have position post flop. I think that it's a really good 3-betting hand, like he says. If it's a late position raise, it's a really good bluff 3-bet hand. So, and as for opening, I often throw this out early position anyway to open, and I might open from middle position on with King Jack offsuit. And like I said, I just think King Jack suited is just a better hand on the button if you're just going to call an early position raise. And I personally wouldn't use it to 3-bet bluff an early position. I would use it to 3-bet bluff a later position.
Yeah, it's a nice candidate for that 3-bet bluff. And we've talked about this on the show before because it's got blockers to some of those really good hands that your opponent's going to have. Pocket kings, ace king, pocket jacks, just it being less likely that they have those hands is good for you when you're using it as a bluff. And I think, as Kim was saying there earlier, and just like Rob was saying, when someone opens from early position, they're going to be doing it with a very tight range. So they're going to be doing it with ace king, pocket kings, ace queen, king queen maybe, but they're not going to be doing it. And all those hands have you crushed. They're not going to be doing it with some of the hands that are worse than yours, like king 10, king 9, jack 8, those dominated hands. You're going to be the one dominated. And so I like this idea of Rob's of using it as a bluff 3-bet because it makes it less likely that they have those good hands. And you're comfortably folding to a 4-bet every time because you're behind their 4-betting range. And also, like Rob says, when they call, well, now you're actually maybe even ahead of part of their range because the hands that they call with are those kinds of king 10, queen jack kind of hands where now you're the one that's got them pipped. So just by making it that 3-bet, and not every time, but as a part of a mixed strategy, that can be really valuable. Rob?
I think one thing we didn't talk about is stack depth, right?
Yes.
I think stack depth is important. Obviously, if you're short stack, the 3-bet bluff is not a preferred method of playing that hand.
Good point.
And I agree 100% with Kim. If it was suited, I'd just call. because it plays so much better suited. You get a lot more board coverage. You got those flush potentials and things like that. But offsuit, yeah, I definitely would not play it in early position. Let's just say we're 100 big blinds deep. We're at the beginning of a tournament, right at the beginning. King Jack is that hand that I'm going to fold into early to mid position and not really start doing anything with it in a raise first in spot until probably the hijack or the cutoff. Yeah. So I'm expecting my opponents to do that also, but depending on the field you're in, you might have some people that are going to get splashy. Then you may want to use that as a deep stack as a 3-bet bluff.
Yep. I like that. And, as we always say, they're not making any more good hands. They're not making any more aces and kings and queens and ace king. So if you want to be 3-betting with a wider range or with a polarized range, then you have to choose not good hands to do it. And then you should be choosing hands like this that have a bit of a blocker value, that have some playability when called because they can make that Broadway straight, which is the nuts, and that's awesome. But that you're also comfortable folding to a 4-bet, which is, I think, why some of those stronger hands might actually even play better as a call because you don't have to worry about getting blown off your equity. Even the King Jack suited hand that these guys are talking about here, you can actually call with that. Because you don't want to get 4-bet. If you do 3-bet, you can actually see a flop. That suitedness, listen, it only makes a difference of 3% to the equity of the hand, but it puts you in a position of being able to play it with a lot more options on the flop when you can add a flush draw or a back door to it, especially if your opponent's going to be that sort of face-up player that is not continuing a lot from out of position. So, King 10 offsuit is actually my least favorite hand, Rob, which just like one pip worse than this one. But they're cousins, and they get along really well. And I don't like either one of them. I wouldn't invite either one of those cousins over for Thanksgiving dinner at my house. I don't want to play with either one of those bums. Forget it. What about if you were in the blinds? Would that change how? So we'll talk about a few different stack sizes and scenarios here. But we're saying if you're 100 big blinds deep and you're on the button, it's one of those spots where maybe you play it as a 3-bet bluff occasionally against some opens. Maybe it's a call sometimes against some opponents, but I mean, to me, it feels like it's either just a fold or a 3-bet bluff in a lot of cases at that stack depth.
At that deep a stack depth, I think that it is a fold.
Yeah.
From all positions versus an early position raise.
Yes. Because that early position raise, as we're talking about, that range is so tight that there's not a lot of extra combos in there that you can get them to fold out with your 3-bet bluff, right? You might not even have a 3-bet bluffing range against that tight range.
It's kind of counterintuitive. People think that, I have 100 big blinds. I have King Jack. I want to see a flop. It doesn't cost me much. I can just call here in the blinds and see a flop. But you stand to lose a lot more. Mm-hmm. And as you get shorter, like under 50 big blinds, now it's a call because now you don't stand to lose as much. It's funny. It's counterintuitive, but it's like now you can realize your equity more when you're shorter stacked, right? So if you can get it in more easily hitting top pair and that sort of thing when you're short stacked, but when you're deep stacked, you don't want to just get it in with one top pair and a medium kicker, right? It's like you just don't. Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, and when you're deep stacked, you really want to be playing hands that can make the nuts. Because the mistakes that you make with a deep stack behind you are more expensive than the mistakes that you make with a short stack behind you. Fareed Jatton, with our premium course last year, would say that the cost of confrontation is much higher when you have a big stack because you've got more to lose. So you don't want to play hands like this where you're going to end up with the second best hand a lot and not know that is the case. And Kim got at this point really well just now, talking about realizing your equity. Poker is a multi-street game. And if you want to really get the most out of your hand, if you want to maximize your actual equity, then you're going to have to make decisions on future streets according to where you are in the decision tree. This doesn't sound very good, but trust me, I'm getting there with this. So when you're playing a hand like King Jack offsuit, you're going to under realize your equity because you're not going to have the confidence to get the chips in. You're going to be over folding. Hopefully you should be, because you don't have a very good hand. And so you're going to kind of only capture part of the equity of that hand. It's just not a good candidate to get to realize all of its equity when you're deep stacked like that. Whereas a hand like a pocket pair or a suited ace or something, where you can play it more aggressively too, that's part of it as well. Because when you flop a flush draw and you shove with your nut flush draw, you're realizing your equity, as it were, whether they call or fold. If they call, you're going to go to showdown and you're going to see. And if they fold, then they're the one that didn't realize their equity. If you're in a position where you're going to be playing the kind of hand where you're just folding a lot when you don't hit gin on later streets, you're basically going to be overfolding this due to the strength of the hand, and you're probably better off just folding it pre-flop, like Kim says. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And Kim, you were saying when you get shorter stacked, it actually plays more as a call on the button.
Yeah, a call or a raise in some spots. You can raise some of the time and call some of the time.
And is it a raise with the intention to fold, or is it a shove? I guess it depends on the stacks.
Well, if you raise with it, you're folding to an all-in, because it's going to be an all-in. It's because when you're shorter stacked, the 4-bet is going to come as an all-in. Yes. Right? It's not going to be a 4-bet most of the time, not a 4-bet bluff. So
also,
it's
if
easy
you're
to
50,
fold.
50 or less blinds, it's probably going to be an all-in for a 4-bet.
Yeah.
When you're starting with 50 blinds or less.
Yeah. And so we can make a 3-bet and still plan to fold to a shove with some hands in our range.
Right. We're not saying you should make a 3-bet, but you can make a 3-bet to some degree some of the time with that hand.
Yeah. But it likes to call in position more at like 30 big blinds than it does at 100 big blinds.
So at 30 big blinds, it's almost a complete call.
Yep.
It becomes a mixed strategy at 40 and 50 big blinds.
Interesting. And then
at higher big blinds, it becomes a fold.
Right. And then probably at shorter, it becomes a shove.
At shorter, it becomes a fold.
A fold again against that early position raise.
Right. So under 20, it becomes a fold again.
I find this part of poker so interesting. So if you think about like the right way to play this hand, and again, just in a vacuum. So we're just talking about in this vacuum of we're on the button, someone makes an early position raise. At 100 big blinds, it's saying that hand isn't good enough. You're going to get reverse implied odds. You should probably just fold that hand. As you get down to 50, it says, okay, well, you can 3-bet sometimes, but actually you can call it sometimes too, because now maybe you can stack off with a pair. As it gets a little shorter, it's like, oh no, just call. You can just get one pair and stack off here. And then as you get shorter again, it's like, no, you want to fold again. We don't even want to be playing this hand for stacks right now, because it's a second best hand.
Yeah. So what that teaches us all is poker is hard.
Yes, it's true. It's true. And there's so many factors to be considering in every given spot, right? Like, I think it trips me up all the time just because I don't know which factors to emphasize in my own reasoning. You've got 1 minute to make this decision. And so you're like, okay, well, I got to think about chip stack. I got to think about position. I got to think about what their opening range was. I got to think about where we are in the tournament. And should I be preserving my stack or going for it here? All these kind of like soft elements of the hand.
Let's bring into the equation something that we haven't even, which is profiling the player.
Mm-hmm.
If we have a player that's opening way too much, we should be 3-betting more with that hand.
Yeah.
Versus calling. If we have a player that is hardly ever opening, we should be folding more.
Yep.
So we have to also be able to profile our players and adjust our play accordingly.
Yep, that's another one of those factors that we have to sort of decide which ones to prioritize when we're thinking about that. Rob, did you have something else there?
Well, I was going to say we should be thinking about that before the hand starts.
Good point.
Position of the tournament, what's your stack size, and what are the player profiles that you're playing against?
Yeah.
Now, early in a tournament, you're probably not going to know. You're probably just going to have to say, okay, this is the population tendencies are they're very rec, so they're going to have kind of a middling range. They're not going to really have specific ranges. They're not going to play specifically tight or specifically loose for a while at the beginning of the tournament. And so once you get into the tournament for a while, then you're going to understand how the different players are playing. So all of that should be done before the hand is even dealt.
It's a great point, Rob, because there are those things that you can only think about when the hand has started. But a lot of this stuff you can really have figured out before the cards get dealt that hand. And also, I think Rob's getting at this too, like the stack sizes of all the other players at the table. We talk about this all the time. Like you use that part of your brain while you're not actually in the middle of a hand, because when it does become time to make those decisions, you want to have all that stuff straight, sorted out in the back of your head so that you can just focus on the very specific nuances of this hand that you're battling with.
I don't know how many times I've been at a table. Let's say I'm on the button and I haven't even looked at my cards yet. And I'm watching the action go by, and I know if this player does this, then I'm going to react this way. If this player does this, I'm going to react a different way. And you can basically, based on the types of players that you're playing against, have kind of a different response based on what cards you have in front of you and what range you're representing.
Yep. And a lot of that stuff, you can really get to the point where without looking at your cards, you can say, okay, well, if I don't have Jacks plus, I'm just folding here. And then you look at your cards and you see pocket tens and you're like, well, I said Jacks plus, but, and then you find out who you are as a poker player. You decided you were going to fold those pocket tens earlier, but
a lot of things I read say that if you're one pip off, it doesn't make that big of a difference in your equity.
That's probably true. That's probably true. A little license to stretch that a little. I like that.
Just makes a small pip in your equity.
Exactly. Yeah, just a small,
it's a
smidgen of the equity that you're going to lose by playing those tens the way you would have played those jacks.
It's only a flesh wound.
So you keep doing that recursively, then you end up playing deuce 7 offsuit like it's aces, and
that's
exactly.
It's only just a pip away.
Just one more pip. Come on, 10s to 9s was okay. Now I can't play 7-2 offsuit. What?
And
would
then
you
all
rather
of a
be a
sudden
tang or a leg?
And all of a sudden you're playing King Jack offsuit in a 100 big blind deep pot on the button to an early position raise.
Oh, you don't want to do that, gang. You do not want to do that. Yep. So are there other like cusp hands in that spot that we want to talk about in that early position raise? We're on the button 100 big blinds deep and we don't know much about the opponent, because I think King Jack is kind of that cusp hand. I think like King Queen, Ace Jack, like you were saying, Rob, Ace 10, those are all kind of similar hands where you're ahead of some, but you're not doing great against the value part of their range. What about a hand like pocket 8s or something like that? Yeah, Kim?
Yeah, no, let's talk about the suited kings.
Okay.
Because I think we want to play the suited kings way more. And the solvers want us to play the suited kings down to like King 8 suited. And then sometimes raising with some of those. So it makes so much more of a difference. Opportunity to play suited hands. And we're all like taught way back when that suited only makes 3% difference or whatever it was. But it makes a lot of difference because now in poker's today's game, it's all about backdoor stuff. So you hit one of your card on the flop, you can play it more aggressively than back in the day where it was just, I don't hit like the nuts or the nut flush or whatever, I can't play. So that makes a difference, playing suited. So, and as for, I think pocket 8s, you're always going to play them. I think pocket 7s and down, it's going to be maybe sometimes, but yeah.
Yep.
I think I struggle a lot in that situation with those types of hands, understanding, should I be raising here or should I just be calling? Calling seems so weak, especially when you're on the button against an early position. It's like, you got your pocket eights. You don't really want to raise with them because, the early position guy can have that so crushed. But at the same time, then when you call, you go, well, geez, I just told him I got pocket eights. Yeah. It's such a weird spot to be in. So bottom line is, when you're in those types of situations, is to, if you're going to call, just be very careful.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get carried away with the strength of your hand in a vacuum. Make sure you're understanding the range you're against and the board. What does a board look like? Obviously, if you spike an 8, you're doing a happy dance. You're jumping around your chair. You're having a good time. You're throwing your chips in the middle. Everything is great. But if you don't get that 8 and then you get a couple of overcards, you got to be very, very careful how you play that hand, and don't overvalue that hand.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that you understand that all you have right now really is a bluff catcher. If the flop comes queen 10 7, you're hoping that he has ace queen because you're ahead right now. So when you face that C bet, you're hoping that he has ace queen, but it's just a bluff catcher. You can't get real aggressive with it. And then to something Kim said about the suited cards, and then going back to what you said about equity realization. I think that, there's not a lot of equity difference between a suited hand and an unsuited hand, but the ability to realize that equity with a suited hand is much greater when you can see one or two of your suit on the board. It gives you a lot more ability to actually realize the equity of the hand.
I think that's a great point. Kim, did you have something there?
No, just that sometimes I would say it's a good idea to 3-bet the 8s on the button, because now you can take a lot of flops away from the early position raiser.
Yep.
If you haven't been 4-bet, now you've they probably don't have aces or kings, and probably not ace king. So on an ace high king 5 flop, you can still play it more as a C bet and you don't even have to play it as a big C bet. And it gives you an extra chance to win with your pocket 8s versus.
Yeah.
I don't mind sometimes 3-betting pocket 8s on the button or in the cutoff or whatever. Like, I think that sometimes they play well as a 3-bet, but I don't think it should be every time.
Right. So. And that's a good point too. And I know Rob was getting at this earlier about sort of like board dependent. Sometimes we think about, you're going to get to certain flops with pocket 8s and it's going to be a value bet, and you're going to get on other flops with pocket 8s and it's going to be a bluff. So knowing what the purpose of your action is a really key part of it. Like when you 3-bet with pocket 8s, that's a value raise that you're making. You're not blocking any of the good hands that you're trying to get your opponent to fold, and you run the risk of having to fold to a 4-bet if that's the way the stacks go, as opposed to a hand like King Jack, again, is what we're talking about earlier, where you are definitely bluffing. You're trying to get folds, and when you get to the flop, it means that your bluff didn't work, and so now you have to kind of have a different approach to your hand. Because you're not trying to win a big pot with that hand, which is, that's where the real poker gets played. I think sometimes we get attached to hands because we bluffed with them pre-flop, and then we're like, oh, well, I'm telling a story that I've got pocket aces here, so I should keep telling that story. And there's an element of truth to that, but the fact is, you actually don't need to bluff all the way through a hand at the same high frequency on every street. Like you should be mixing your bluffs and your value hands differently from street to street, depending on the action, and we maybe that's a whole other podcast that we could do an episode on sometime, making that mix of value hands and bluff hands depending on what kind of size you want to make your bets and raises. I think that's its own podcast.
Right, and it's important to realize that when you're 3-betting your eights on the button versus an under the gun raise, you're 3-bet bluffing. And you're trying to get hands like ace queen offsuit, ace jack offsuit, king queen, or king jack suited, all of those hands that have good equity against your eights to fold. Right? So that's what you're trying to make happen. When you 3-bet eights versus a cutoff raise, you're 3-betting eights as value.
Yeah.
So it's important to sort of recognize all of those parts of a hand, right?
Yeah, there's definitely that late position player is going to have a lot more combos of hands in their opening range that they're going to fold to your raise. So it's going to have that effect. It's going to have the effect of being a value raise. Was that something, John? Is that something that we talked about in a forums post a while ago? That it's a value bet if it gets called by worse, and it's a bluff if better folds. It's like doesn't really matter what you plan for it. It's just how it gets. I think that was right. I think that was John posting that in the forum.
Michael Acevedo talks about you don't bet for value or a bluff. That's the result.
Right.
You bet to either realize your equity or deny your opponent's equity is basically the reasons that you bet. And the results is either you bet for value or you bet for a bluff. That's a bluff.
Yeah. I think that is
a different way of looking at it. But
I think that's a good way of thinking about it, because ultimately, your opponent has this entire range of hands and you're ahead of some of them and you're behind others. So they're going to, you play this hand a million times against them. They're going to respond differently with every hand in that range. And against some of them, it's going to end up being a value bet. And against some of them, it's going to end up being a bluff. So the best thing for us is when they can fold a better hand. That's just always the best thing for us. If we can get someone to fold a better hand than ours, then that's good work done. Work well done by us. So I guess that's another reason why we might choose to call with a hand like ace jack suited, but 3-bet with a hand like ace 10 offsuit or something like that, or king queen or king jack or something like that, because ace jack, the better hands are not going to be folding. It's going to be hard to get ace queen, ace king, the big pocket pairs to fold. So when you're 3-betting with ace jack, it's kind of like a weird middle of your range, your value range kind of 3-bet. If you're 3-betting with ace king, you're hoping to get called by worse, like ace queen, maybe even by ace jack. And if you 3-bet with ace 10 offsuit, ace jack offsuit might fold. But that's why hands like ace 5 suited are such a good candidate for this 3-bet, especially when you're in position and deep stacked, because you still get that blocker value. You still get some of that playability post flop. You're behind when they 4-bet, so you can comfortably fold, right? Those are the three things we were talking about. And people will fold better hands. If someone does open ace 6, ace 7, ace 8, ace 9, ace 10, they're probably folding those to that 3-bet. So you'd be more inclined to call with some of those better aces, keep those hands in their range so that you can beat them post flop, and 3-bet with those weaker hands like that as well.
I have a question for you. You 3-bet, they 4-bet. How quick do you push the fold button or in a live tournament, throw your cards in? Do you pretend like you had a really tough decision, or do you just automatically just throw the cards in?
I'll be honest with
that's a metagame thing, right?
It is, but I have a real answer for me, especially if it's early in the tournament. I don't want my opponents to know that I have a range of hands that I open with expecting to fold. So I never insta-fold when they raise, because I almost want to be like, oh, well, what am I going to do now? Because even just the notion of having a hand, I'm going to 3-bet this and fold to a raise, you're already kind of outing yourself as someone who has thought at least a certain level of sophistication about what the purpose of raising is, and that kind of stuff. Thinking about ranges, oh my God. So I honestly, I do wait. I do wait a couple seconds, and I just like, well, I guess you got it this time, and toss them in.
I can verify the fact that it's more than a couple of seconds.
Yeah, that's right. Well, sometimes I take a little longer, Kim, if I have a real decision to make.
Well, it depends on your opponents too. I think, it depends on where you're playing. If you're playing your home game with a bunch of your people that know who you are and what you do, why bother delaying? Just throw it away. They know you're doing it sometimes.
Yeah.
But like you say, early in a tournament, especially a live tournament, you don't want people to know that you're 3-betting and then immediately folding.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's the same for post flop stuff too. You just don't want to have any of those check raise / instafold or c-bet / instafold. Cause it shows a level of sophistication that I don't think you need to advertise.
Except for when that old guy, that raised in early position.
Yep.
And you're sitting over there on the button with your king jack and you 3-bet. And then he goes all in and you immediately muck and look at your neighbor and just nod your head. Yeah.
That's right. But I'll tell you, if that old guy is paying attention, he better sneak in a little ace-5 suited next time, because that's the other thing. You do that auto muck. And you're kind of putting it. It's not in his DNA.
Can't do it.
He's not in his DNA. Yep. And that's a great point, Rob, because honestly, like against certain players that aren't going to vary their style according to new information at the table, then I think you have to be worried a lot less about balance and disguise and that kind of stuff, because it's just not going to be as important as it is to a thinking player who's going to really take you apart and think about your play as opposed to the play of the other players at the table, because those thinking players, every piece of information you give them is a weapon they can use against you. So I do think there's something for that.
Kim? It's an easy snap fold versus 100 big blind all in 4-bet, but
right.
It's you got to think about it till the min click back by the pro and the under the gun raise.
Yep, that's right. So, what are some other? What should we? I don't want to take this conversation too long, but I think it's an interesting one. What are some of the other factors that we might consider? So, we've been talking about in position against an early position raise, pretty deep stack. We've talked about how different stack depths might affect our decisions. We've talked about how the suitedness or some of the hand characteristics. What if we were in the blinds and it's the same action, early position raise coming around to us? So the two differences are now A, we're going to be out of position, and B, we're kind of getting a better price on whatever we choose to do. We can call for a bit of a discount, or we can 3-bet for a bit of a discount. Specifically, Kim and Rob, do you have any, because you've been taking a lot of the conversation about this in position, when you're out of position, how does that change things?
When you're deep stacked, I think you're folding a lot more.
Yep.
I think you're all folding a lot more from the small blind versus the big blind. I think when you're in the big blind, you're calling a lot of suited hands and things like that. I'm not sure of the exact range.
I think King Jack off is probably a call.
I think it's a fold.
I don't know.
That's why we're talking about it, because it's that cusp hand is right in the middle.
Yeah, but you're defending the big blind against whatever position. You're defending at almost 55% of the hands.
Right.
If King Jack isn't in that group, I don't know what is.
King Jack is not in that group at 100 big blinds deep.
What's the percentage?
King Jack offsuit. The lowest offsuit hand is Ace Jack offsuit that you're defending.
Really?
In the big blind.
No.
Wow.
I'm talking 100 big blinds deep.
Yeah.
Really?
We're all still in that fallacy of having all these chips and we can afford to take a shot and, but
if we take it to 75 big blinds, which is much more common deep stack than a tournament, we're hardly ever over 100 big blinds deep.
Sure.
Now we're defending almost all suited hands and offsuit down to King 9, Ace 8 offsuit. So you got to realize when I say that it's very rare that we're in that spot, and much more common that we're less than 100 big blinds. And now we're defending really widely in the big blind. So and especially in a tournament where we have the ante in play. So there's more, we should be defending more when we have
that's a good point. Because early in the tournament, when chip stacks are deep, it tends to be before the antes have been introduced. So the pots are less worth stealing. So you should be playing with a narrower range. Kim, what are some of the hands? So let's say at 100 big blinds, we're in the big blind, and we see an open from early position. I also thought King Jack would be one of those let's hit a flop hands. What are some of the worse hands that aren't the offsuit aces? Like what's the I'm like Rob. I thought our total calling range would be wider there as a percentage. What's the total percentage that we're supposed to be defending in that spot?
I don't know for sure. I don't have that up. I have 75 big blinds, and then I have 100, but it's cash, so there's no ante involved. So we have to. It's somewhere in between the 75 and the 100. Somewhere in between. So if I was going to guess, I would say maybe King 10 offsuit some of the time. And King Jack offsuit some of the time, but not all the time.
And this is in that 75%, 75 big blind range is what you're saying?
Well, in the 75, in the 75 big blind for sure. But if you're saying 100 big blinds, I think it's somewhere that those cusp hands might King 9, King 10, King Jack, some of those fall off.
Yep. No,
but it's somewhere when we get to 75 that they are in there as a defend.
And we are talking, before we started recording, we are talking about this. The solver often will put out a mixed strategy where it's like fold 74% of the time, call 24% of the time, and 3-bet 2% of the time. When we look at that as recreational players, we mostly just say, okay, just fold. It's mostly saying fold. So you can work about, you can call sometimes if you want, you can 3-bet sometimes if you want, but mostly it's going to be a fold. Sometimes they have a solver output that's like 55% you bet this size and 45% you check. That's truly a mixed strategy. But something like this where it says you should just mostly be folding hands like this, that's one other good point. Don't worry about over folding these cusp hands, because the amount of EV that you will gain by playing them correctly all the way through the hand is pretty small. The amount of EV that you will lose by playing it incorrectly is much bigger than that. And when you fold, all you give up is that little bit of EV that you would have gotten from playing a cusp hand perfectly. And so you're just not giving up that much by turning that opportunity down.
Right.
That's a folding mistake. Folding mistakes are generally going to be good mistakes to make in spots like this, where you're just declining to take a marginal hand and try and wrest the most possible EV out of that bad hand. I really encourage people to just fold, pick a better spot. We don't know how to make the most out of that hand anyway. We're more likely to misplay it than to play it perfectly. So you're not giving up that much by passing.
Right. And I know I've said this before, probably more than once, but don't bet half pot. No,
never want to do that.
Not that. But what I wanted to say was, it's really counterintuitive, because when you have lots of chips, you want to defend your big blind widely, but just fold.
Yep.
And as you get shorter, start defending your big blind wider and wider. And as you get quite short, like 30 big blinds, less than 30, you should be defending almost everything you're dealt to in the big blind versus one raiser. So it's counterintuitive to what people want to do. They have 100 big blinds, 200 big blinds to start a tournament. They just want to defend everything in the big blind. And you should just be folding almost everything in the big blind. And then as you get shorter, you should just defend almost everything that's suited and most of your other. And I would suggest people look at the at the charts to sort of get an idea before they go and play a big tournament of where you're defending your big blind, because you're going to be mostly in hands in either late position or in the big blind. So like sort of learn those hands and learn those ranges before you go play.
Yep. And note that Kim's not just talking about King Jack offsuit here. We're talking about your entire range when you're deep stacked. You should be defending less at 100. You should be defending the big blind with fewer hands at 100 big blinds than you should at 50. Because being out of position post flop with a second best hand, you're just more likely to lose chips than to win them against that stronger range that's going to be playing in position against you with a stronger range, and often also with the initiative on their side. So it's just look, any poker hand can flop two pair. Any hand, well, not the pocket pairs. Most hands can flop two pair. And so if your theory is, I'm just going to call with this hand because every once in a while I can flop two pair and really put one up on my opponent, you really should be doing that with every hand. Like now that ceases to become a meaningful variable now, because literally every hand but pocket pairs can flop two pair. So if you're ever saying to yourself, oh, but if I flop two pair, boy, I'm going to really ring it up on them here. Well, then you should look, it shouldn't matter what two cards you have in your hand. So then you got to go to the next level and be like, okay, well, since I could always flop two pair, let's get a little more detailed about what is it about this hand that makes it a good candidate for this action that I want to take. And, when you're in the big blind, when you're going to be out of position, deep stacked, it's not going to be a lot of those. It's not going to be a lot of those second best hands. So what kind of characteristics do we want to play in spots like that, gang? Probably things like suited aces, like we were talking about, hands that can make the nuts, pocket pairs where we're going to have really easy decisions, even out of position post flop where we either hit a set or we didn't. Some suited connectors are nice to play in that way because you're going to get a lot of different ways to play your hand. But again, you're going to be, if you're playing against an early position raise, there's always that danger of you having 6-7 of hearts and they've got ace queen of hearts. It's a lot easier to get flushed over flushed when you're playing out of position with those smaller holdings.
I just think that one of the things you need to always be aware of, if your opponent is willing to put a lot of chips in the middle, they more than likely have a hand.
Yeah.
And if your hand is second pair or top pair weak kicker, I would not get married to it. I would say, I think I might look for a better spot because he's willing to put a lot of chips in the middle. It's very easy for him to have a hand that has you dominated.
Yep.
And I see a lot of people go down to the river because they just don't believe. They can't believe that they finally hit a hand. They hit something. They made a part of a hand, a top pair or a middle pair and a good kicker. And it's just, I can't believe that he has a better hand than me. I'm gonna find out. And if they put a lot of money in the middle, they have a better hand than you, and you just lost a lot of chips.
Yep, it's true. I'm working with one of my coaching clients earlier today, and we were looking at some of the ways that their winnings are expressed through different hand strengths. And it just reminded me so most players, when you look at all the different absolute hand values you could have at showdown, a royal flush, a straight flush, four of a kind, a full house, every player, when they end up with those hands, they are winning. They may not win every time they get a full house. Sometimes they'll have the smaller full house, but in their lifetime, playing full houses and quads and straight flushes, they are a winning player when they have those hands. Obviously, they're very strong hands and they're hard to beat. A lot of players are also going to be winning players when they have three of a kind, straights, flushes, two pair, because those beat a lot of hands. So most players are winning players when they have those strong hands. This might be counterintuitive, but one pair, if you're a player that goes to showdown with one pair, a lot of the time, a lot of the databases that I look at players are a losing player with one pair hands. In their entire history of every time they've played a one pair hand to showdown, they are a losing player in that spot. And it's not because the hands are any weaker than the other players who are getting to showdown with one pair. It's how they're playing their one pair hand against their opponents. And it's just like Rob is saying right now. If your opponent's shoveling chips in the middle, one pair is a losing hand. It doesn't matter how good a pair it is. Over pairs. If your opponent's shoving chips in the middle on Jack 8-4, and you've got a pair of aces, and you bet and he raises and you re-raise and he shoves, sorry, kid, like you're dead. So
we're talking deep stacked. Let's caveat that.
Yes, good point. Good point. Yes, that's true. 100%.
Yeah, we've been talking 100 big blinds, so I was kind of in that vein of, let's not get carried away when you've got a big chip stack, because if they're shoveling chips into the middle, you can decimate your stack in a hurry. And there's forum posts out there. I know I put them out there. John has put them out there. We've all put those posts out there where early in a tournament, you've decimated your stack because you got carried away with a hand that you shouldn't have.
Yep. And just one pair of hands. They feel strong to us. And so we play them strongly, but often we're value owning ourselves with those one pair hands. And we should probably, against certain opponents in certain spots, we should probably be treating them more like bluff catchers, choosing to check back a street, making it a small ball hand. Just because, it's not a kind of hand that wins big pots. All right. Well, I think that was a pretty good. We found a few rabbit holes. I feel sorry for Chris because he actually had a hand that he wanted some advice on post flop, and we're not even gonna touch that. Sorry, Chris. When next time you want to make it onto the show,
he probably shouldn't have played at post flop, right?
Good point. Well, honestly, that's true, because just like we're saying, you get into these spots post flop where to actually get your EV back out of the hand that you put in by playing it, now you've got to make all these hard decisions. You got to actually play poker, and that's hard to do.
It's like John? They were about 60 big blinds effective, as it turns out. So
right. No, that's in that no zone, I think. John Somsky, did you have something there?
I was going to make a joke, but I forgot it now.
It was probably about Chris not being good enough to get the EV out of King Jack offsuit post flop.
Oh, no, it was actually about, I really don't think we want to make Chris any better anyway. So if we were going to give him any advice, I think we should give him bad advice.
That's a good idea. Well, Chris, if you're listening, just keep it up. Keep up calling with that King Jack on the button against that early position raise. And actually, Chris is one of the people that I think probably could turn that into a winning play. But for the rest of our listeners out here who are not the director of membership content here at Rec.Poker, doing all the seminars and putting a lot of our teaching material together, then I think, you're probably better off just turning that spot down. And you'll trust me, they're going to keep dealing cards. You're going to get another hand very soon, and that might be a better spot for you to take a shot. Well, I think we should probably roll on out of here, gang. This was a really fun conversation. I never know what we're going to talk about when I show up here, but we didn't let Rec Poker Nation down on this one, I don't think. That was a fun one. So without any further ado, I got to thank Website AMP and Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. Chris for putting that one in the post. John, Rob and Stu, Kim, and all of you, the listeners, thank you so much. See you again soon.